Vaquera-Vasquez. And let me tell you a little bit about Professor Vaquera-Vasquez. He's many things. He's an unrepentant border crosser, he's a writer, he's an ex-DJ, and he's an academic. He's an assistant professor of creative writing and Hispanic Southwest literature and cultures in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of New Mexico. He traveled all the way from New Mexico yesterday and the day before just to be here for us today. He's also taught and lectured at the University of Iowa, Penn State, and the Universidad de Salamanca, the Universidad de Alcalá de Henares, and the Universidad Pompeu Fabra, and Texas A&M University. He's the author of 3 collections of short stories. The most recent one he's brought with us today. I believe we might hear a little bit of this book. Can we see it? Let me hold it up. The name in English, right? This is first full-length book in English, published, right? One day I'll tell you the things that I've seen. In Spanish, algún día te cuento las cosas que he visto. So we're very excited that we get to hear from this brand new book. He's published widely in a variety of other places and other journals. His academic work focuses on U.S. Latino cultural expression, U.S.-Mexico border cultures. He has presented at various international conferences, and he loves Turkey, and spent quite a bit of time here. Many of you know him because he came and visited us here in the fall. So we're very happy to have him back. Let us welcome again to the field camp Professor
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. I should have probably been sitting down, but I feel that if I sit down, I'm going to fall asleep. I got in very late last night. My flight was, my travel time was, oh, sorry. I guess I should use the microphone. My travel time to get here was 33 hours from New Mexico. So, but I'm very happy to be here with you all today. And I think what I'm going to do is I've been asked, some of the students had asked me about doing some kind of a writing exercise. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a bit, and then I'm going to talk about sort of like how I write. And if I'll be here today and also tomorrow, so if anybody is interested in writing, I'm more than happy to meet with you all sort of individually, and we can talk about it if that would work with you all. But again, thank you so much for the invitation. So happy to be here again at Bilkent. It is true, I spent a lot of time in Turkey. My family is convinced that I have another family over here since I spent so much time here. I'm going to talk briefly about sort of the work that I do, and then I'm going to read briefly from my new book. Check time. Okay. And again, before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for bringing me out yet again to this lovely campus. I'm always happy to come out here to talk with friends, to see friends, and also talk with students. So I think it's important as a professor and as a writer coming out and dialoguing with people, especially as a writer. I think it's very important to be able to get stories. Now, as Professor Reimer said, right, I guess I am many things, right? In Spanish, I often joke that I'm a vago, right? I'm a wanderer because of all the lives that I've had. And in some ways, right, migration is sort of the story of is the story that I work through. Is also the story of my body. So as a child, one of my favorite books was the Book of Lists. It was an almanac of curious information and trivia. Lists included worst places to hitchhike, people misquoted by Ronald Reagan, 18 famous brains and what they weighed, 10 words you can't pronounce correctly. And I didn't think about this book, the Book of Lists, for many years until 2003 when I picked up the latest novel by Alberto Fuguet at that time. He's a Chilean writer, which was titled Las Películas de mi Vida, and the translation is The Movies of My Life. And the narrator of that book, Bertrand Soyer, he starts talking about the gift he received from his grandfather, the Book of Lists. For the protagonist, that gift then becomes a point of departure for the eventual listing of the 50 movies that shaped his life. Because of those things that happened, right, the Book of Lists also shaped my life for collecting random scraps of information and also for making lists. Because lists, as Umberto Eco once noted, they can serve as attempts to make infinity comprehensible. Right? They can make sense of the world that we live in. One of my favorite lists is by Sandra Cisneros in a story that has many lists. It's a short story called Bien Pretty, from her book, Woman Hollering Creek. The narrative begins with a border crossing, the move of Lupe Arredondo from San Francisco to San Antonio, from one Chicana experience to another. Lupe arrives at Texas with her California past pared down to a van load, which consists of, and I quote, a futon, a stainless steel wok, my grandmother's molcajete, a pair of flamenco shoes with crooked heels, 11 huipiles, 2 rebosos de bolita y de seda, my taekwondo uniform, my crystals and copal, a portable boombox, and all my Latin tapes, Rubén Blades, Astor Piazzolla, Gypsy Kings, Inti Illimani, Violeta Parra, Mercedes Sosa, Agustín Lara, Trio Los Panchos, Pedro Infante, Lidia Mendoza, Paco de Lucía, Lola Beltrán, Silvio Rodríguez, Celia Cruz, Juan Peña Lebrijano, Los Lobos, Lucha Villa, and Dr. Loco and his original corrido boogie band. This is a particular list that I really love because one of the things that we do that we do as writers is sort of to give an idea of character is to condense a lot of information in as small space as we need. And so when we look at this list, it's telling for what it has to say about Lupe's carefully constructed sense of Chicana identity, Mexican-American identity. It's one that is influenced by a sort of pan-Latin Americanism, Latino identity, but as well as Asian cultures of San Francisco, because she's moving from the West Coast to San Antonio. And so when we see this in things like the Taekwondo uniform, right, or her pan-Latinidad comes through in the style of the clothes that she wears. And also for me, it's also in the music that she's listening to that sort of shape her own Latina identity, right? Their music, there are examples of music from Mexican boleros to salsa to flamenco music to Chicano rock in the case of Los Lobos and Dr. Loco and his original corrido boogie band. And so through this list, Cisneros then tells us as much about the character of Lupe and her interests as if she had developed each one individually. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a list, sort of a series of vignettes where I tell a story of wandering, of writing, of language, and of reading. And it's basically a story. It's a story of language, a story of mixed codes. It's a story of movement, because it's a story of migration, because migration is the story of my body. It is also the story of my tongue. One of the things that I'm doing as I read from my iPad is that I tend to switch a lot between Spanish and English. So I'm trying to sort of minimize keep my tongue to one tongue, which is very difficult because I grew up bilingual. I grew up speaking Spanish and English. So for me, I'm always sort of inserting Spanish words, or when I'm speaking Spanish, I'm inserting English words here and there. And one of the things that I'm interested in, and this could be something that if any of you want to continue this conversation, is what happens when you have cultures in contact and you start mixing your tongues, right? So what about Turkish German? I'm always fascinated by those kinds of language mixes, because I come from a community that is bilingual, that is in daily contact with another, right? English. And so it's as part of my own history, I think it's important to sort of recognize that. I've mentioned that I'm a Chicano. Y'all familiar with what a Chicano is? What is a Chicano?
Oh, first years.
Yeah? What is a Chicano? Anybody? A Mexican American, yes. Yes, yes. Buses, yes, you're right. It's a Mexican American. My parents are originally from Mexico. They crossed the border a few months before I was born, so as I often say, I was made in Mexico, born in the USA. Right? So, and there are many of us in the United States. And so it's important that the Mexican American Chicano community is an important element of what it means to be American. But I think it's also important to recognize that this is a community that can also say more about being Latin American at the same time, right? Because we grew up sort of in between these two communities. And it's not that we're trying to sort of get rid of our Americanness, right? We're not trying to be less American or whatever American means. But it's important to recognize that we also have another part of us, right? That we have another tongue, that we have another cultural identity, and we need to maintain that. And in communities in contact, I think it's always important to remember this, that we have, if you have more than one root in a country and ethnicity, you need to be able to maintain those. And how do we do that, right? So the Chicano writer Tomás Rivera once stated that the Chicano Creative Act consisted of three things, and he was writing in Spanish. So he said, recuerdo, descubrimiento, and voluntad. Recuerdo, remembrance, right? We can see this in the poetry and the narrative and the theater of the Chicano movement. For example, Luis Valdés in his Teatro Campesino, or in the remembrance of the struggles of the Mexican farm workers in the Southwest. We can see this in the recuperation of symbols, right? In the use of Aztec mythology to sort of help explain the presence of the Mexican American in the United States. The corridos, the border ballads that have been around since at least the 16th century, and that have deep roots also in Spain, right? And we can also look in remembrance at the 20th century Mexican American social figures, right? The Pachuco, the Zoot Suiter, who helped reconfigure the nascent movement of the Chicano movement of the 1960s. We can look at it in our writers, like Tomás Rivera, author of Y no se lo tragó la tierra and The Earth Did Not Swallow Him, and the work of Rolando Hinojosa Smith, a writer from Texas, who can trace his history, the history of his family, back to to Spanish conquistadores explorations in the late 18th century. We can look at it in Rodolfo Anaya, a writer from New Mexico, who wrote a fantastic novel called Bless Me Ultima, and helped talk about the experience of the northern New Mexicans. As I often say, aquí estamos y no nos vamos. We're here and we're not going anywhere else. Descubrimiento, discovery. Chicano culture is hybrid, right? A corrido is a hybrid construction. The corrido I mentioned is a border ballad. Its roots are traced to the Spanish romance, which is a type of ballad, lyrical ballad in the Middle Ages that was used to tell stories, that was to tell news, to pass on information, right? And then so the corrido has this social function in the Southwest in the 18th and 19th centuries, where we see the stories being told of famous Mexican American social figures who often found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Descubrimiento, a discovery of the Mexican side of the Chicano experience. Voluntad, the third part, the will to act, the recognition of a long historical trajectory. As I said, we're here and we're not going anywhere. So these three words are important for the Chicanos and Chicanas of the Mexican American civil rights generation, the Chicano movement. They gave the literature and art a sense of purpose and urgency, if I can, as members of an ethnic community that has been historically marginalized. Recuerdo, descubrimiento, and voluntad, right, helped build our own agency. Because they are as important to the writers and artists of the Chicano movement as they are to my generation and the generations that follow. And one of the things that I always stress is the importance of storytelling. I grew up in a family of storytellers. When I was young, my summers were spent in Mexico, in Mexicali, right on the other side of the US-Mexico border, in California. And in the evenings, I remember my uncles and my aunts sitting around the kitchen table, telling stories. It was after dinner, we would always sit around and they would tell stories about relatives, about people they knew. And sometimes, this is the part that always freaked me out as a kid, they would tell ghost stories, right? Because those were the ones that, then they would go on from the family, and then they would go into the cuentos de espantos, right? Oh, well, over here, you gotta be careful over here. And then they would say, talk about ghosts. Those are the ones that often chilled my spine, even to this day. And Mexicali, when I was a child, I came to realize seemed to be full of these stories, right? Mexicali then, as a place, was haunted by stories in many ways. But more than the types of stories, it was the act of storytelling that got me. Because it is in stories that we start constructing community. We start knitting together and giving shape to our lives. Inevitably, in the stories that were told by my family, there was the one about the friend, the relative, the cousin, the uncle, the aunt who died or disappeared, the one who went away. And in the telling of their stories, they were bringing that person back. Because this is why we tell stories, right? We are bearing witness. We are bringing back those who are ours. We are knitting our community together. Storytelling then is a form of entreatment, a binding to one to another. Storytelling in Chicano literature and our own process of reading that story also then as a way serves to impose itself over that which is said about this community, that which is fixed. Because in the United States, right, we're often, the American ethnic writers are often inscribed under a particular narrative. Oh, well, if you're a Chicano writer, you must be writing about a barrio life or farm worker life. Or you're all working class and you're all poor. If you're an African American writer, you're this, right? And so the importance of us telling our stories is to sort of undermine all of those negative narrations that try to encapsulate who we are. So in the act of telling stories, we are overcoming the narratives that would be imposed upon our community. And the overarching narrative that's imposed upon the Latinos in the United States is one that we don't belong, right? That we do not belong in the U.S. When the reality is, there are my two favorite posters from the Chicano movement. One said, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," right? We still see every so often. My other is the one of the Aztec warrior holding up a sign that's kind of like, he's kind of almost in an Uncle Sam pose saying, "Who are you calling illegal, pilgrim?" The Chicano poet Ricardo Sanchez once wrote, "Who are we? We are the urgent voices." And the Latino communities in the United States, filled with stories and storytellers, are those urgent voices, eager to stand up and declare ourselves. So as I said, I was born a Mexicano in the United States, right? My parents crossed the border a few months before I was born. In their act of border crossing, they, along with their children, remarked, because I carry the border with me, an X inscribed on my body, border crosser. Spanish was my first language. I began preschool at an early age, and then I became part of the English-speaking world. So I learned English when I was fairly young. And in that process, I became then a Mexican American. Hyphenated, I spoke with what I refer to as a forked tongue. Spanish at home with family, and English at school. In my university years, I became politicized, and I took on the Chicano identity. But I continued to speak with my forked tongue, often mixing the two languages into Spanglish. Leaping, as I often tell my classes, de una lengua a otra in a single bound, como Superman. Years ago, a colleague of mine in linguistics asked me to participate in a language study, and the result was that I scored very highly as a bilingual. That is, both my languages were más o menos, more or less, on equal footing. But what does it mean then to speak with a forked tongue? To have on a tongue more than one? Right? To maintain dual languages on equal footing? What does it mean to be a one that is more than one, or a one that is at times more than two? And so these are the kind of questions that I've been working through in my own writing and my own work. Let me jump to another story that's very similar. As you all know, as I travel a lot. I travel a lot. And the thing about a passport, which is interesting, is that Salman Rushdie once said that a passport is a story, right? It's a book, right? And It's a story about you, right? But what is that story? Because it all depends upon the reader. My second passport, begun in 1998, I'm actually on my fourth now, I think, told the story of frequent travel. And by 2005, I had already almost completely filled its pages with stamps from Spain, France, England, Turkey, Colombia, and Mexico. There were stamps upon stamps, marking out 7 years of constant travel. My passport told me then a story that was largely happy. Memories of travels, conversations with friends, exchange, dialogue. But for customs officials, my passport told a very different story. Standing in front of a passport officer in Madrid, waiting to pass through passport control so that I could make it to my boarding gate for my return flight to New York City, the agent flipped through my passport carefully, looking over each page and each stamp. Finally, he returned it to me and he said, "Usted viaja mucho." You travel a lot. It was not a question. It was more of an accusation. Because to be a traveler in a post-9/11 world is to be cause for suspicion. Suspicious for not only being a traveler, but for being a wanderer. A person que no conoce un lugar fijo, a person who does not know a stable place. And a person like that does not know nation. All he saw, all the customs officials saw were pages of entry and exit stamps. In short, my passport told him a story of instability, of rootlessness. In a sense, a story of shame. Because if I was proud of who I was, why do I travel so much? And in some ways, this is the question that we often get asked about our desire to maintain our Spanish, our Mexican identities, our Latino roots as Mexican Americans in the United States, right? If English is, as I've often heard in the U.S., if English is good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for the U.S., right? Which I always find very funny, but it's this feeling that somehow that if we speak another language, you are somehow suspect, right? Because you've dared to allow another tongue onto yours, and you cannot then have a stable identity. And my argument is that you can, because it's very necessary. It is urgent. It is urgent to remember that when we live in communities in contact, when we live in a country that prides itself, at least nominally, as being diverse, we must accept what that diversity means. We must accept that there are people in the United States that grew up speaking Spanish and English, Korean and English, Hmong and English, German and English. That this is an important component of what it means to be a member of a nation that prides itself on being diverse. So, my stories, my book, is a book about traveling in many ways. One day I'll tell you the things I've seen. It's a book that traveled from one language to another, since I publish primarily in Spanish. And this is the weird thing, right, that I often get asked. It's how is it that you, who grew up in the United States, who grew up in English, decided to start writing in Spanish? And my first response to that question was, why not? Why couldn't I write in Spanish, right? After all, it is the other half of me. But we seem to believe that if you grew up if you were educated in a particular way, right, that's going to determine the course of your writing career. And this is not true, right? There are a number of writers who switched. I mentioned earlier the case of Alberto Fuguet, who was a Chilean author who was born in Chile, but he grew up in the United States. Up until he was 13, his language is English. And when his parents moved the family back to Chile when he was 13 years old, he suddenly had to start living in Spanish again. And so his his Spanish writing is very interesting because it is inflected by his English of his childhood. There's the case of Eduardo Halfon, who's a Guatemalan writer, who also grew up in the United States, trained as an engineer at Chapel Hill in North Carolina, moved to Guatemala after he finished his bachelor's degree, moved back basically after after many, many years of being away. And then he became a writer in Spanish. So these kinds of things, these kinds of questions I always find fascinating. Why can't we be allowed to express in the language that we feel that it is important? There's the case of Daniel Alarcón. He's a Peruvian writer who was born in Peru, but who grew up in the United States, and he writes in English, right? Because he does not belong to what we often sort of view as the primary Latino groups in the United States, which are Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Dominican, he should be writing in Spanish, but he does not. Right? He writes in English, and so I think that this is an interesting question. Why should we be forced to create in a particular language? Why can't we be experimental, or why can't we use the tongues that we have at our disposal? So I wrote in Spanish, and when I first started writing in Spanish, I wanted to write because one of the things I have to deal with, right, as a writer who grew up in the United States, was often this question: well, if you're going to write in Spanish, you better write it correctly. And one of the realities of Spanish, because it is a very diverse language, right? Mexican Spanish is different from Spain Spanish, is different from Guatemalan Spanish, is different from Caribbean Spanish. And so when I was writing, I tried to write as standard, as neutral as possible. But the reality is that our tongues will eventually give us away. My Spanish is a Mexican Spanish, but because of my years of living in Spain and my travels into other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, I say things that are not Mexican, that people will often comment on. Well, that's weird. Why do you say that? That's very Spanish. And that comes from the fact that because of the places where I've lived. But once I realized that our languages give us away, I realized that I could write in any way that I wanted. And so I write in what I refer to as, or what some refer to as Spanglish, right? This mixture of Spanish and English that is so important for Latinos in the United States. And there's not just one Spanglish, right? The Spanglish that is written by a writer like, say, Junot Diaz, who I think is another great Spanglish writer, is one that is inflected by the Caribbean, right? So it's very different from mine. But I think it's very important that we remember this. So I write in Spanish. A number of these stories from my latest book are originally written in Spanish, and then I translated them into English. And that act of translation is a very strange experience, because I realized that I started making changes. I am the author, I can change my own work, right? But I went so far as to actually change a couple of stories completely, where the narrator of one story became another character, right? So I completely changed perspective and tone. And this is one of the things that I have at my disposal of being bilingual. The fact then that I can go in and I can make these changes. But then what happens is I would go back to the Spanish version and I would change that too. And it became a very strange dialogue between these two texts. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it briefly from one of the stories. The book was originally titled Snapshots of People I've Known. I've already mentioned that for me it's important to write about, to tell stories about the people I've known, or the stories that I've heard in the streets. And I've one of the things that I benefited from traveling is that I've met a lot of people. Right? There's one story that I often like to say, is that when we talk about this new in this age where we're always connected, right? So like on Facebook or Twitter, we have these connections now that can be that are connections that are very vast. So my first time I came to Ankara was in 2007. I came for a conference, and I took the train back from Ankara to Istanbul, and I took on the train. Once I got to Istanbul, I took the ferry across European side, and then I went to a hotel, right? And I was leaving the next morning. So I get up the next morning. I take a taxi to the airport very early, and while I'm waiting in line to check in, I started talking to a woman who was also obviously traveling like myself. We started talking. She started telling me her life. We ended up having breakfast together. We talked for a long time. We were on the same flight from Istanbul. We were flying to Amsterdam, and she was flying on to England, and I was flying on to back to the U.S. And when we got to Amsterdam, we talked briefly, and then she went to her gate, and I went to mine. I've never seen her again. And yet, about once a year, we talk, right? Because we're friends on Facebook. So she sends me an email to see how I'm doing. Oh, I see you're back in Turkey. Or I'm doing this now. I've moved to California. And so we talk. And so our connection then even though we met each other briefly for an hour or two, right, years ago, we still have a connection. Now, can we call it a close friendship? No, we cannot. But we can certainly talk about sort of the sense of how we start building our connections to others across the internet. So this story, Snapshots of People I've Known, which was, it's one of the stories that was written originally in English. And the story is that. It's a series of brief snapshots. This began somewhere between Eskişehir and Izmit, somewhere just past the mountains, out on the flat fields with the afternoon sun hanging low. The train rounded a bend, and there they were, a family of goat herders out in the field. A child waved at the passing train. My camera was in my bag at my feet. Not enough time to snap a pic. I stared out the window with the child waving from the field, a thin arm raised into the sky. Then the train flew past, and I watched as the child grew smaller and smaller. I returned to looking straight ahead at the back of the blue cloth-covered seat with the Turkish Railway logos neatly printed in red. Eric stands with his back slightly turned to the camera, his face in profile against the night, on the deck of the ferry from Karakoy to Eminönü. Another ferry passes in the background, its light blending with those from the Asian shore of Istanbul. He looks out over the water, his hands in his coat pockets, buttoned up against the November chill. Eric was a photographer from Peru living in Istanbul. He told me he wanted to leave the chaos of Lima to experience someplace else. At first, he lived in London, but he missed the locura of what he called eccentric cities. He moved to Istanbul and found a job with a small advertising agency. We met over at the train station. I was hungry after the long trip from Ankara, so I headed straight for the restaurant. The waiter directed me to a table near the door that opened out onto the waterfront. Eric was at the table next to mine drinking a beer. When he saw me pull out a copy of Josefina Vicen's El Libro Vacío, he started talking to me in Spanish. He soon joined me at my table, and I was really not in the mood to talk much, as I was tired from the trip. Later, on the ferry to the other shore, I snapped a photo of him looking out over the water. In this photo, Tanya looks down at the floor, a cup of coffee in front of her. She is about to tell me something. Muddy Waters Coffee House, San Francisco, evening. She left her Lebanese-Spanish family in Madrid for San Francisco. It took her 4 years to arrive. One afternoon, she told her family she was leaving the country and walked out. We met in Schiphol Airport. We were both getting off a flight from Paris. Standing on the movable walkway heading towards the departure hall, we struck up a conversation about airports. Her favorites were Schiphol, Narita, Munich, and oddly, Mexico City. This last was on her list because she loved the city. She especially loved flying into it at night when the Valley of Mexico was lit up and appeared to be a reflection of the stars above. Her least favorites were JFK, Caracas, Heathrow, and Charles de Gaulle. As we had just arrived from that airport, it was singled out for its poor layout and the long distances one had to walk to get to the gate. We stopped at one of the bars in the departure lounge. While she ate an apple and I drank coffee, she talked about her travels. From Madrid, she had gone to London, then to Berlin, with a side trip to Kazakhstan, where she was an au pair for a summer. Then Rio de Janeiro, and finally Paris. She was on her way to New York, where she had another job lined up. Her job was to make it to San Francisco. And later, as we walked to our gates, we stopped at one of the glass windows and looked out at the parked jets and tried to guess where they were going. After a while, She looked at me, smiled, and walked away. 2 years later, we saw each other in San Francisco, where I took her picture. Silvio worked at the bar at Rosendo's, a hole-in-the-wall antro in Cholula. A Dominican who left Santo Domingo for New York, he ended up traveling west to Denver, where he hooked up with a collective of young nomads, his description, and ended up crossing the border in El Paso, and then continued south past Mexico City to Puebla. The Dominican drifter, I called him. I was living in a friend's apartment in Cholula for the summer. Walking around close to the campus of the Universidad de las Americas, I found Rosendo's bar. It was packed with undergrads from Texas, study abroad students, Silvio told me later. They were the bar's best customers as they often headed there for lunch. Rosendo's made some of the best tacos in the area. One would never have guessed with the grimy exterior and rundown look of the place. In the evenings, the place was packed, as the students would return to drink cheap beer and talk loudly about their classes. And the bar often contracted a mariachi for parties for the students. One party Friday, Silvio and I went for a walk around Cholula. He had the day off until the evening when he had to work the bar. We had lunch in the main plaza of the town, and we talked over a big bowl of sopa azteca. His parents had held high expectations for him. His older brother was a doctor. His younger brother was planning to study law and become a lawyer. As the middle child, he chose to drift. When he showed me a photo of why, I understood. He was on the beach with his arm around another man who was kissing him on the cheek. A simple gesture, but the look on Silvio's face gave everything away. Rather than come out to their families, his novio became a border guard and moved to Dajabon. Silvio was left with his broken heart and a city that alienated him. He left the island for New York and then just kept moving. I know a thing about loss, I told him as we sat outside Rosendo's drinking tecate. Later, with a mariachi behind him and the two students by his side, Silvio smiles for the camera. Lauren was a barista at the Java House in Iowa City. She was from a small town in Iowa and studying at the university. I first met her when I was having my bouts of insomnia. After 2 weeks of not sleeping for more than an hour, my dream life began to invade my waking life. I felt like I was in a constant state of jet lag. Senses were heightened, colors more intense. I went one afternoon to buy a cup of coffee, and Lauren was at the bar reading a magazine. I asked for a cup of the St. Louis Blues, a name that resonated with me and was how I always imagined St. Louis, somehow blue because it was tethered to the Mississippi and anchored to the continent as the gateway to the West. And I also ordered a strawberry Danish. It was the last one. She made a joke about how I was now leaving her with no lunch. She explained that she had just started a new diet, the pastry diet. In subsequent weeks, I would ask her how the diet was going. Well, she would respond with a smile, I'm losing weight. I saw her one night with her friends at the airliner. She wore a red dress, accentuating her pale skin and dark blonde hair. All the women around her were in little black dresses, as if cut out from the same mold, cookie-cutter women doing the bar crawl. She recognized me sitting at the bar, drinking a beer, and trying to figure out how to sleep. She came over to talk, and we ended up leaving the bar together. It was raining, and there was thunder and lightning, the whole spectacle of late summer in Iowa. All we needed were the tornado warning sirens going off to complete the scene. We drove an hour across the electrically charged plains to Iowa 80, to a place called the world's largest truck stop. When she excitedly accepted the offer for coffee at the truck stop, I knew that she was going to break my heart. It was then that my insomnia broke, and I knew that I was going to be able to sleep again. Lauren came closest in covering up the absence that my ex-wife, Aide, had left. 6 months after that night at the truck stop, when I felt the urge to pack up and go, she tried to hold me back. At the same time, she knew it was impossible, because movement was the only thing I knew. In her photo, she smiles at me from the cab of a long-haul truck on display at the showroom at Iowa 80. When we were driving back to Iowa City after coffee and pie, I knew that she'd inserted a part of herself into me, and that as soon as I dropped her off, I should start moving again, with haste. But I didn't. She moved across the city to a soundtrack of mambo, danzón, boleros, and salsa. Pérez Prado, Tony La Negra, Hector Lavoe, everyone has to have a soundtrack, she told me. One night, under the cliched blanket of stars, we sat on the old Sutliff Bridge drinking bottled beer and speaking in hushed whispers, as if to not interrupt the sounds of the Cedar River passing below, the crickets, the frogs, and the stars. And months later, when I looked at her photo, I would wonder how she was doing. Whether she was still at the Java House reading magazines between customers, walking home from downtown, making random lists in her notebook, whether she ever thought of me. And after I left, I carried her photo along with the receipt for the coffee and the Danish for my first visit to the cafe in the box where I keep my snapshots. Years later, when I returned to teach in Iowa City, she was long gone. This all started on the train from Ankara to Istanbul, this taking of snapshots of people I've known. There are, of course, some that I don't have. I don't carry any photos of Aide, for example. Sometimes I wish I did, but most times I just have the memory. Aide on our wedding day, lying back on the bed of our hotel room with her dress unbuttoned and eating chocolate chip cookies. Aide with her feet in the air, reading a book in our cramped apartment, a look of concentration on her face, a pencil in one hand. Aide waiting for me at the airport when I arrived from another trip, her face bursting into a smile and her arms opening wide to embrace me. Aide crying over dinner as we tried to avoid the issue of a marriage that was reaching its end. Aide walking out the door for the last time, and me later placing the remnants of our house in boxes, packing a bag of clothes, and then walking out for a trip that had no end. And so that story then came about because I didn't want to tell a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. I wanted to tell a story that was built on this idea of a character who has no idea of a story, who's on a journey, right? Who's just collecting snapshots of people that he's met. But he has all of these histories and all of these stories, but he doesn't have any more close connections. And of course, since I read the ending, right, you sort of figure out why. But going back to my earlier point about storytelling, right? I think it's very important that we need to tell the stories of the people that we see and the people that we run into or that we encounter on our paths, right? Whether we're traveling internationally or whether we're just traveling in our own countries, right? Because it's important. It's important to know how other people live and the stories that they are telling or living through. Right? And so going back to this earlier point from Tomás Rivera, right? I think this is the important thing about my generation of Chicano writers is that as we move beyond the Chicano movement, which was all about creating a link, a justification for why the Mexican-American presence was justified in the United States, I think it's also important to recognize why the Mexican-American presence is also a part of a larger Latin American presence, but also in some ways sort of a global presence, right? That the stories that we tell are stories that are very common in many ways for other communities and other identities. Thank you so much.
Does anyone have any questions for Professor Vaquera-Vasquez? Who's it?
I was wondering about, we've been learning about the syntax and the use of punctuation in the stories. Do you think about it when you write, or does it just come to you?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I discovered was you can do a lot of things with punctuation, right? And definitely with syntax. One of my favorite writers, and one of the writers I wrote my dissertation on, is a Mexican writer by the name of Daniel Sala. And when he first started writing, he passed away a couple of years ago. When he first started writing, his stories are very, very weird, and his novels are very strange. His first novel was written in decasílabo, 11-syllable verse, right? So every sentence in the novel is 11 syllables long, right? Use counting in Spanish, right? That there's I'm trained in a Latin American in Spanish tradition, so I don't really know how to count, say, meter in English. But in Spanish, right? So he would write in an 11-syllable verse. His second novel was written in 8-syllable verse. Right? Super difficult, right, to maintain that kind of rhyme scheme. And then he would also, because he was a writer from northern Mexico, he would include a number of words that were not common in Spanish, right? A lot of norteño words. And so he was definitely a writer who paid attention to the syntax as well as the punctuation. And so when I first started writing in Spanish, I wanted to sort of try to emulate that. But it's a very difficult model to maintain. And doing it in English, I think, would be weirder, right? It makes sense in Spanish, and here's why. The endecasílabo is a very common line, verse in Spanish, especially it's what is known as the verso alejandrino, right? It's the Alexandrian verse, very common in the Middle Ages. And the octosílabo, the 8-syllable verse, is probably the most common verse or meter in Spanish. It's the one that is often used for corridos. It's the one most often used for storytelling, right? For these kinds of ballads. So, yeah, I mean, I thought about it. I tried to, but when I started writing in English, I've had to learn a whole other sort of language, which has been part of this interesting experience of traveling as a writer from one language to another. Yes.
A few years ago, I read research about how people, some researchers did personality tests with bilingual people, and they saw that they have different, not different, but different from each other, these two personalities when they are speaking Spanish and English. And would you say that you have different older personas while you are writing in Spanish and English? And
I like
is
that.
The reason, the difference, and the struggle when you were.
Yeah, I like that idea that somehow I carry a multiple personality, right? I mean, that it is, but in many ways, right? If you speak more than one language, it's true, right? You do happen to have a different personality because of the differences in language. Spanish, for me, tends to be a little bit more warmer, much more of an intimate type thing. But so, yeah, as I started writing in English, what happened throughout my career was that my writing career as a creative writer is in Spanish. My academic career is in English. So I find sort of English. Somehow in my mind, I made English to be sort of like a language of rationalism, right? But I refer to it as my Spock language, right? So it's the language of logic, right? And that's how I would write academic works sort of in a more logical, structured manner. But so when I was trying to start translating into English, I don't want that because I don't want to come off sounding like Spock, right? I started trying to mix things up, and on a related note, my own academic writing has also shifted to become much more personal and less rational, or less following a strict scholarly line. But it's true, right? When those of us who are bilingual, we have little quirks in our language. The trick is what happens when you mix them together, right? Then you start noticing that a person can shift within a sentence, which I think is actually really fascinating to me. Right, thanks. Somebody else? Yes.
Would you prefer one language, or do you like using both?
I actually like using both. As a person who's never really lived with one language, I always think sometimes I think it'd be much easier. It's like these things that you think about, wow, if my family were more normal, it would be nice. But then I think to myself, but at the same time, I wouldn't want that. My family is great. I love my family, but they're they're a Latino family with lots of emotions. I viewed my sisters as being, they were less human and more forces of nature, right? Just become this very, very angry and loud arguments. But I like that, right? I like that. You know how in every family, I don't know if this is true in Turkey, but in every family, at least it seems to be in Mexico, or Latino families, every family there's always the aunt, right? The relative who's crazy, right? The one who's just always coming up with ideas and always wants to do adventures, and all the nephews love her, right? This is the same thing in Turkey, right? There's always like that one aunt that you think she is amazing, right? She has always these crazy ideas, and we want to follow her to the end of the earth. My mother was that person. So I grew up with the crazy aunt, and so we would always, my mother would suddenly wake up in the middle of the night and say, let's go to Mexico. It's a 12-hour drive. And I'm like, okay. We get in the car, and we wake up in the morning, we'll be in Mexico. Right? So it was always these kinds of things. And to this day, she still tries. She lives with me now, because I'm taking care of her. And so she can't go off on as many crazy adventures as she used to. But she still tries to. So one time she came to visit me before she was living with me, I was teaching in Pennsylvania, and she wanted to visit me, and she wanted to visit my sister who was living in New York at the time. And she lived in California. And I said, this is great, Mom, you can just hop on Interstate 80, one of the interstates that runs across the country, and it'll take you straight here. You'll be here in like 3 days, because she wanted to drive. This is my mother's thing, was she loved to drive. It'll be here in 3 days, and it'll be easy. She goes, no, I gotta go see your grandmother in Mexicali. It's just 12 hours down to Mexico. I'm like, okay, fine, well then you can hop on, I said, these other freeways, and you can get it, it'll be 4 days. She goes, no, but I want to go see my comadre, right, her friend, in Houston. I'm like, okay, just call me when you get near. Right? So a month after she left, she finally called me. But she would call me, and she would be like, I'd be like, where are you now, Mom? She's like, oh, I'm in New Orleans, this is great, I've never been here, it's fantastic. Or she's coming from some random town in Arkansas, because she decided she wanted to explore the country. She was by herself, driving. And this is how she lived, right? So, when I was, every so often I would think, well, it'd be kind of nice to live in a more normal family. But then I think, no, actually I wouldn't, right? So it's the same thing with language, right? It would be sort of nice because I see people who are monolingual and I think, that could be okay. But then I think, no, I would actually like the idea that I can jump from one language to another. And this is why I always like, right, when I talk to students, or when I'm in countries where I know that there's a lot of migration, right? So, like for example, in Spain, I always talk to students about the mixing dialects between the different languages on the Spanish Peninsula, Catalan in Spanish, or Galician in Spanish, or if there's any switches moved if they go to France, right? So Turkish German I think is fascinating. My ex-wife is a linguist, and she works on bilingualism. And so she used to look at Japanese English, which I thought was always interesting because there's a much wider sort of geographic region that divides the two, but it exists, right? Or French Algerians he looked at too for a while. So yeah, I think it's important, right? That if you have access to another language, enjoy it. Right? I think it's important to recognize what it is that other languages can do for you, and how you can work through them and use them. One of the things that I always ask my students too is, I teach in the Spanish department, so I always ask my students, and a number of them, before I moved to New Mexico, but many of them grew up speaking English and learned Spanish later on, so they're acquiring Spanish at a later age. And so I would ask them, why are you learning Spanish? And my students would often say things like, well, because I want to be a doctor and I want to be able to talk to my patients. I want to be a teacher, and it's important. And I know I can get a better job if I'm bilingual. And those are all important reasons, I think, right? To use language that way to communicate. But I also tell them, I said, Spanish is such a great language for telling stories too, and that we should think in terms of this other languages as not just sort of service. Right? It's great to be able to communicate, and it's important. Right? But remember that the other language that you have, right? Those of you who are, especially those of you who also have English tongues, right? You can use that language to create, and that's a fantastic thing.
When you use Spanish in your English writings,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel the need to make an explanation of the words, or you just go with it?
That's a great question, because this is something we often see with Latino writers. If you look at, say, somebody like Sana Cisneros, right, when she drops in Spanish into her English, she puts it in such a way that it's easy to understand, right? So it's a cognate, right, between English and Spanish. Or she will do things like She'll say it and then she'll translate it. She'll say things like, más o menos, more or less. Right? I don't do that. For a number of reasons. It doesn't come naturally to me. The other thing that we often see in Latino writing is that when they use Spanish, they put it in italics. Right? And this is the editorial tradition, right? That if you're using a foreign language, you need to throw in the word into italics. But as I often tell my editors, I don't speak in italics. So no, right? My characters live between languages, and they need to be able to to keep them at the same level. So if we look at someone like Junot Diaz, right, who's really fantastic, because in Drown, his first collection of short stories, he still followed that tradition, right? So switching, when he would make the switches, it would be an easy enough switch that you could understand what it was, or he would translate, and then the word was often offset in Spanish. But as he has become, as I often say, Junot Diaz, the man, the myth, the legend, right? The major Latino author in the United States, he is incorporating more Spanish into his writing, and he's no longer making those kinds of cues to the readership. It's just sort of this is the reality. And the question that we always have to ask ourselves is, why are some writers allowed to not have to translate? Right? For example, Cormac McCarthy. I don't know, maybe you read Cormac McCarthy, right? You read a novel like Cities on the Plain or All the Pretty Horses, and he will have an entire paragraph written in Spanish with no translation at all. Nobody questions it. Right? Junot Diaz writes a story and puts an entire paragraph in Spanish with no translation at all, and people are freaking out. Oh my God, who does this guy think he is? Right. So this is something that we as writers also need to, we as ethnic writers in the United States always have to to fight against. Of course, on the other hand, right, what about readers who don't have any sort of Spanish? So what about readers outside of the U.S.? That's a great question, and that's something I haven't really sort of grappled with. And international readership just yet. Anything else?
Well, if there's no more questions, I think we can move on to our first panel session. Also, as Professor Vaquera-Vasquez says, he will be around, so engagement and conversation. If you have a question, feel free to talk to him about writing at any point during his visit here. Let's give him one more round of applause.
Thank you.